Hi everybody, and welcome to the last episode of Now and Men for 2023. I'm Stephen Burrell, and I'm here as usual with my co-host Sandy Rexton. Hi Sandy.
Hi Stephen, it's good to link up with you again. Now, before we introduce our guest, you've got an exciting piece of news for our listeners, haven't you, Stephen?
Yes, I have. Yes, thank you, Sandy. Yes, it's a bit of a changing time for me as I'm actually moving to Australia in the new year, as I've got a job as a lecturer in criminology at the University of Melbourne. I've also found love out there as well, so it's all very exciting, but also a lot going on. This shouldn't mean any change to the podcast, but we will take a little break during the Christmas period, which will just allow me some time to get my feet under the desk in Australia, so to speak.
Well, congratulations, Stephen. But as we know, the show must go on, so we're delighted to welcome Blake Morrison to Now and Men today. Blake is a poet, he's a novelist and journalist. He's perhaps best known for his trio of family memoirs, including the award-winning And When Did You Last See Your Father, which came out back in 1993, then Things My Mother Never Told Me in 2002, and his most recent book, Two Sisters, which was published earlier this year. And he's a regular literary critic for The Guardian newspaper and the London Review of Books.
Yeah, so hi Blake, and thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for asking me.
Oh, it's our pleasure, thank you. And so we thought it would be good to start, if that's okay, by inviting you to read a passage from Two Sisters, which introduces your sister Gill and your half-sister Josie, and some of the themes that you expand upon later on in the book.
Yeah, this is very much setting things up at the start of the book. Here goes, yeah. If you're listening to this, my sister is dead. Many years ago, I resolved not to write about her while she was alive, or rather, not to publish anything that I had written. She, Gill, had walk-on parts like a film extra in 2 memoirs I published about our parents. That's all it was, the odd look-in or passing mention. There was plenty to be said, but not yet. Even if she'd given me carte blanche, the page would have stayed blank. You can't write an honest memoir when the subject is alive. At any rate, I can't. Death is the only permission. After those books about Mum and Dad came out, I was sometimes asked if I'd another memoir in me. No, I'd reply. I write fiction these days because I've run out of family. Once or twice I answered even more facetiously, I don't know if I've another memoir in me, but my sister's quaking in her boots. There's an assumption that to write honestly about someone is an act of aggression. That's the gallery I was playing to. But I felt no aggression towards Gill. Didn't then, don't now. She's gone, that's all. And though there's no retrieving her, I'd like to make sense of who she was and what she became. It wasn't just that she changed over time. She could change from day to day. Drink made it worse, but the origins went deeper. You never knew which you'd get, the kind and loving Gill or her doppelganger. 2 sisters. I had another sister as well. Josie's a smaller part of the story I'm telling, a half-sister, whereas Gill was full and often full on. A baby sister, proudly held up to Gill and me as we stood at a hospital window on the day that she was born, but whose relation to us was never acknowledged. A sister I didn't know was my sister until 8 months before she died. 2 sisters, both younger than I am and both dead. It's painful to think about that and tempting to let them be. But I want to understand why their lives took the direction they did and why they died self-destructively before their time. I know there's no simple answer, that I'm writing from the limited perspective of a brother or half-brother, that my memories are fragmented and unreliable. Still, I can't not make the effort. With Gill, I can't help making it. What she went through, and what her family went through, many others have gone through too. My hope is that telling her story will prompt recognition, perhaps the solace of commonality too. And that means being honest. The ethics of writing about real people are problematic. Candour can seem disrespectful. But when you grow up with a lie, as my sisters did, it's important to be truthful. Soft peddling would be cowardly. And the truth isn't malicious. I'm here to commemorate them, not expose. It may be I've another, more selfish purpose. Self-exoneration. When you're newly bereaved and the death of the person you're mourning strikes you as preventable, guilt is impossible to avoid. Why didn't you meet more, speak more, tell them you loved them, assuming you did? If you had, might you have saved them? My sister's deaths left me feeling neglectful. And when I turned to books for comfort or commonality, I found neglect there too. I hoped to find an author whose writing about a sister, real or imagined, could articulate my thoughts and feelings, whose insights could help me see things I'd missed, whose words could stand in for mine. Low as I was, even the greatest book might have failed to reach me. But I hadn't expected the choice to be so limited. Why did so few books explore brother-sister relationships? In particular, why did so few male authors write about sisters? Did their sisters not matter to them? Or the relationship in general not matter enough to merit inquiry? Brothers writing about brothers, sisters writing about sisters, sisters writing about brothers. There were many examples of those. But brothers writing about sisters? Very few.
Thanks, Blake, for that very powerful reading. And there's a lot of things we could pick up there. But first thing is, I thought a key phrase in the reading was, I'd like to make sense of who she, meaning Gill, was and what she became. Would you say that was your main motivation for writing the book? And did your perception, your feelings towards Gill as your sister change as a result of writing about her and your relationship with her?
Well, I probably did articulate things that I hadn't until I sat down and put it on paper. That's often the way with writing a book. I don't know where I'm going with it really, but I know there's something I want to explain, if only to myself. And I guess the big thing with Gill was that, we grew up in the same house, we had the same childhood, we were only 16 months apart, and yet our lives went in such different directions. Now, was that to do with me being male, her female? Was it to do with a different way of us being treated? Did I get privilege as the boy? How much damage was done when Gill went off to boarding school at age 11 because of that terrible thing called the 11 plus, which she'd failed and I'd passed. She was quite damaged in some ways and quite self-destructive in the latter part of her life, and I just wanted to understand where that came from, where it originated.
And you say at the end of the passage that there are very few examples of brothers writing about sisters. I wondered if you had some thoughts on why that should be. I mean, it's a theme which permeates the book, isn't it? The notion of what you call sib-lit.
Yes,
do you want to say something about sib-lit?
I'm a proud contributor to sib-lit. I'm trying to develop this genre and highlight this genre, because so many memoirs are the vertical kind, to do with parents, child, and how about the horizontal ones, siblings? Siblings are the people that we know for longest in our lives, longer than partners and even friends. It was just a natural part of grieving, if you like, is that you go looking for understanding, and you think, well, there have been brother-sister relationships in the past. There must be historical examples I could look to, and there must be written examples in novels and memoirs and so on. And I was just struck by the lack of them, and I've put plenty, as it's sort of a subtext to the book, I've put plenty of examples of brother-sister relations and the different ways in which they can work. But I suspect, it is a patriarchal thing. It is that brothers didn't think their sisters were of sufficient consequence to write about, to put it crudely, and that sisters were helpers and quite often played a really key part in lives of artists, writers, even politicians probably, and yet were never fully acknowledged, and that was all part of a culture where men had priority.
Mm, mm. And I wondered also, are there any examples that you found particularly sort of salient or insightful in terms of sib-lit? Is there anything that our listeners should be having a look at?
Well, I mean, I think the case of William and Dorothy Wurds is probably the best known. I mean, Dorothy had a huge impact, and including, some would say, him, using lines of hers and appropriating them. And her whole reaction to his getting married quite late on was I think really interesting too. I look at the example of J.R. Ackley, who horribly kind of mistreated his sister in some ways, although she was difficult, and who was nearly culpable in her committing suicide. It was a narrow escape for which she blamed him. So there are many different kinds of the relationship between siblings, but I think there was a traditional expectation that the brother would adopt a protective role. The brother was in some ways responsible for the sister's welfare, for the sister's marital status, and so on. And that's a very difficult role to accommodate in the contemporary world. I think that imbalance where the brother takes responsibility for the sister. But it was interesting to think about it and look at it in examples I came across.
I mean, maybe that takes us back to your relationship with your sister as well. That's a protective notion. I mean, at the centre of the book that you've written is Gill's addiction to alcohol. It's a subject which we haven't really addressed on the podcast, and very often it's men drinking rather than women. But I wondered if you wanted to say anything about her drinking and the sort of complex reasons why she was.
Yes, I mean, I think where we grew up in rural Yorkshire, the pub was the place to go, and I think she formed a relationship with her husband to be in the pub, and they were both kind of loners who became lovers, and drink was all part of that. And things changed when she had children, and she had two, and when he still had the freedom and availed himself of the freedom to go out to the pub in the evening, and she couldn't. So she began to drink at home. It became partly secret activity that she indulged in, and she hid bottles around the house. She had secret arrangements with taxi drivers who collect things from the off license for her. She wasn't a terrible drunk. I mean, she drank in order to sleep very often. She just kind of knocked herself out. She wanted oblivion through drink. But it obviously caused major problems in the family. She had the care of two children, and the marriage was put under strain. And my parents, who were living next door, it was pretty bad for them in their latter years. So, it was a mess. And I felt I had to be honest about that in the book, not cover the truth about the extent of her drinking.
Because you also say, make an interesting comment in the book that men, when they're roaring drunk, have a license to misbehave, whereas women are stigmatized for similar behaviors. You quote the American author Leslie Jameson saying, "Male drunks are thrilling, female drunks are bad mums." I mean, that does refer back to what you were just saying, really. But that sense of responsibility that's placed on women for children's upbringing, children's welfare. Whereas men somehow escape some of that, don't they?
Men escape that, and there's perhaps an extra sort of pressure to do with, if you're a good girl, good woman, you don't drink too much. You're the model of restraint, while your male partner can do as he wishes. So sort of, the associations of being a female drunk are very damning. There's an imbalance there between male and female.
And connected to that, you also say at one point, we pitied her, but we also blamed her as well.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult when you've got an addict in the family, because you get so exasperated and probably at times impatient and unreasonable because they're so difficult to handle. And Jill, and blame is difficult to avoid. It's difficult not to think, this is a failure of will. If you tried harder, you could get over your addiction. And obviously that is an insufficient way of approaching it, but you can't help having those feelings sometimes. And people tried. My parents were living next door. They tried. She went into rehab. Her husband used to lock drink in the boot of his car rather than having any in the house. Efforts were made, sometimes of a fairly crude kind. But an addict is an addict, and she tried. She had periods of being dry, but she struggled with it. And whenever she had a bit of freedom, wasn't being overseen, overlooked by somebody, she drank all the more.
There was something I found very powerful about the book, really, because I think it is a widespread social issue, really, isn't it? But it's not something we do like to talk about very much. And the way you talked about it, honestly, I think people will find that very meaningful, and well, certainly I found it very affecting. And the sensitivity with which you handled that. And another issue, which is a kind of bit of an undercurrent in the book, is that of kind of male violence. So, for example, Auntie Beatty's husband, Sam, took a swing at your dad when he discovered your dad was having an affair with Beatty. And you make clear that Sam had a longer history of violence towards Beatty. Or your dad, who kind of locked your sister Gill in the cellar for several hours around the age of 22, 23 after she'd been found to be stealing. And I suppose what struck me most was your attempts to try and understand retrospectively, like what had happened in each of these cases, and also perhaps the efforts of the adults involved to try and gloss over and hide the reality of what was going on. Do you think that's a fair description of that?
Yes, it is. In some ways, when I think of other contemporaries of mine and their fathers, many other memoirs I've read on fathers and sons, my father was not noticeably violent. I was never hit by him. He once raised his fist to me and threatened to hit me, but he didn't. But nonetheless, there was a huge undercurrent of violence in the culture. And what he did with Gill, as you've mentioned, after the stealing, seemed cruel and crude beyond belief, really. I mean, my mum said it was 36 hours or something that he locked her up for, and I don't know whether she was given food, whether there was light, whether there was water for her to have. I don't know the details. All I know is, as a way to make her behave, it seemed such a primitive, and horrible method. And he had a hot temper, even if it didn't erupt into physical violence. So, I guess I've always been interested in this. One of the things that I also wrote as a poet was the Ballad of the Yorkshire Ripper, which was about Peter Sutcliffe. And, growing up in Yorkshire, not far from him, at fairly similar time, I'm not much younger than him, it really struck me, when everybody was thinking about murder, what I was thinking about was misogyny, and how his picking off prostitutes, as they were called, and even though many of them were not, was all part of this misogynistic idea of women as evil and needing to be stamped and stabbed out of them. And, I felt there were things in him and things in the culture I grew up that I wanted to address and addressed in that poem, rather than it being about, the brutality of the murders.
Yeah, it strikes me as well, like maybe perhaps a common theme in your memoirs is, I suppose, the often kind of quite hidden, unrecognised, but massively important role that women are often playing, like in the family and keeping the family together, keeping everybody in the family together, like emotionally, but also bearing a lot of the collateral damage, I guess, for the turmoil that's going on in families, perhaps especially from men. Is that something which you've always sought to kind of do?
Yeah, yes, because, you see, my parents' marriage was quite interesting in that my mother had come from Ireland. She was the 19th of 20 children. She felt, I think, dispossessed of her name, her home, her religion, and everything in marrying my father and making a life in rural England. And she was self-effacing, and she allowed herself, I guess, even though I think she was a better doctor, to be dominated by my dad, to be, persuaded into joining him in a GP practice when she'd rather have been working in hospital, in deferring to him, in knowing that if she tried to end the marriage when he was having an affair with a friend of theirs, that she couldn't leave and take the kids away because he'd just follow and try and grab them back. And so she felt, the ground was not firm under her feet. And, professional, intelligent woman though she was in a subordinate position in that marriage. But she was the one who held things together at home primarily. Even though my dad was probably a bit more domesticated than a lot of men of his era.
Yeah, and I guess the perspective you offer in your books as well, perhaps, do you think it offers a bit of a corrective to any notion that the 50s and 60s was a period of stable family life?
No, absolutely. And I suppose I'm really conscious of it primarily because of my half sister, because I always suspected from being, well, I guess from the age of 9 or 10 when she was born, I noticed my dad doting on her. And then when I became sexually aware, 12, 13, whatever, I immediately suspected she was my dad's child. But she was passed off as a friend's child. They came on holidays with us, as friends would. Her mum was called Auntie Beattie, as if she was an aunt, not a... And so on. And it was... Yeah, it was secrecy, but of an odd kind, in that she was assimilated almost within the family, and yet there was a secret at the heart of it all. So this idea of the 50s is this lovely era where everything was so much more wholesome and harmonious, I just find ludicrous. Yeah.
We were thinking of delving a bit further into your first book now, and when did you last see your father?
Yes.
Which encapsulates some of the themes and tensions at the heart of family life very well, I think. So, do you want to read that piece now, Blake, and then we'll talk about that?
This comes about a third of the way through the book. So, yes, I think I'm coming up to the age of 12, I think, something like that. Anyway, here we go. After toast and marmalade, my father and I retire to the 2 tip-back chairs which face out through the sash windows towards the moor. He is checking the share market, I the sports pages of the Sunday Express, where I stare for hours at the blurred anguish of a backward arching goalkeeper as a shot from Burnley's Ray Pointer, white dotted arrows painted on the photo to trace its path, inflates the net behind him. For me, at 12, the ultimate erotica, the breast-like bulge of a top corner. My mother, having cleared the breakfast stuff, is back again now with 2 mugs of coffee. Made with hot milk, mummy. Smashing. It's my father who says this, not me. All through our childhood he has called his wife Mummy, never Agnes, her actual name, which he hates because it sounds drab and old-fashioned. Never Kim either, the name her friends use and which he persuaded her to adopt, not so much to seem chic and 50s, was it plagiarised from Kim Novak, as to erase her rural Irish past. She has shed her name, abandoned her country, and buried her Kerry accent. In return, he calls her Mummy. Until now it has sounded fine, but at 12 it's beginning to embarrass me. I want to call them Mum and Dad, which is what my school friends' parents are called, but which they think common. And I want them to call each other Kim, or even Agnes, and Arthur. It's a futile ambition. My father will never change his habits. He'll go on calling her Mummy. Glass of wine, Mummy love? Long after my sister and I have left home. He'll call her mummy with increasing frequency once his own mother dies. And he'll call her mummy not just in front of her grown-up children, but in the company of friends, strangers in pubs, even when they are alone. It's your half term coming up, he says. I've been thinking. It's time we went camping. Camping? You know, fathead. Tent, poles. Just the two of us, boys together, or men together. I have just had my 12th birthday. This is what he must mean by men. The thought of a camping holiday with my father fills me with dread. We could go to the lakes, just us. The girls could drive up and join us for a meal out together at the end. It's good to get away sometimes, you know. We love Mummy and Gillian, but there are things we're better off doing on our own. No faffing about or worrying if they're cold. You can't imagine them enjoying 3 nights in a tent like we will. Under the stars, fresh air and exercise. Marvellous.
I love that extract.
That's a rough approximation of my dad's accent, I'm sure.
No, it was very good. It was
horribly wrong.
It was very, very convincing, actually. But I love that extract. You know, and as I say, it does encapsulate so much about family life. So, you know, women servicing men's needs, men controlling women, father-son relations, becoming a man, stirrings of youth rebellion, all these kinds of things are in there, I think. But do you think one of the reasons why the book was so successful was precisely because it resonated with many readers who recognise sort of points of connection with their own family relations in there?
Yes, I think so. Very much so. And I suppose also because it was an unusually intimate account of a family. I mean, the intimacy was partly because it was describing my father's cancer diagnosis. So we're living through the period, just a few weeks really, between the diagnosis and his death. And I guess the whole intimate way I talk about the family life and describe his illness, growing illness, and so on, was you know, relatively unfamiliar at that time. You know, in a memoir. Memoirs have since, I think, become a lot more popular as a genre, but back then, you know, though I could think of a book that had come out the year before, Philip Roth's Patrimony, which, you know, had this similar kind of candour about it. Still, it in the UK at that time, I think it was a bit unusual, and that was one of the things that resonated.
Yeah, and it feels like your father represented perhaps a particular kind of type of white middle-class British masculinity of the 1950s, 1960s. So one which is perhaps quite patriarchal, controlling, traditional, practical, unemotional, you know, these being some of the archetypes of masculinity at that time. But of course the book was successful not just in the UK, but in many other countries as well. So did it surprise you that the portrayal of fatherhood that you presented did find such a ready audience elsewhere?
Yeah, no, absolutely amazed me. I can remember going to Damascus, a British Council trip, and somebody being so struck by a reading I did, they said, I'm going to translate the book. And so it came out in Arabic, and you wouldn't necessarily assume there would be, you know, the same kind of stereotypes that people were responding to. And yeah, I think you're right. My father was a classic, almost stereotypical father of the period. He had been in the Second World War. He'd had a very gentle war compared with many men. And it also, when he came out of it, unlike most men, he would talk about his wartime experiences, you know, fairly gentle though they were compared with many people's. But equally, you know, he'd lost his sister's husband had been killed. He'd had friends killed. You know, he'd been through it for 3 years or whatever. And I think one of the things was, for that generation of men, was to come out of the war having survived, was what you wanted to do was create your own family, have your own setup. You didn't have great ambitions to go around the world and travel. You'd done that, and during the war probably. And, you know, it was like this amazing piece of luck and privilege that, you know, you'd survived and you could start a family. There was a kind of, I think utopianism is wrong, but, you know, if you think the welfare state and all that was created in the late 40s, there was a period of optimism. We've been through the worst, and now we're going to build a better society. And conservative though my dad was in many ways, he was in on the inception of the NHS as a local GP, and he was part of all that kind of progressive forward movement. And it was a very interesting generation of men, I think, who'd gone through that.
And you've said that when you wrote And When Did You Last See Your Father, that you thought that the kind of father-son non-fiction genre of books was something of a kind of empty field. But last year you wrote a piece for the Guardian newspaper, which we'll share in the show notes of the podcast, about a number of books about fathers and sons. So yeah, do you have any feelings about this kind of dad-lit? And are there any particular authors you would recommend listeners to read there on father-son relations, apart from your own one, of course?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I deluded myself that there weren't many father-son memoirs. The ignorance was a great help, because it made me think, I'm doing something new here, writing a book about my dad. But there had been a book I mentioned the year before, Philip Roth's Patrimony. There had been further back classics like Edmund Goss's Father and Son, like J.R. Ackley writing about his father. And really, the more I looked, the more I saw there had been many books in this field, and it continues. I mean, if you were thinking about a younger generation of men and where they might find some connection in a father-son memoir, they might look at something like Charlie Gilmore's Fatherhood, which is about becoming a father, but also looking after a bird. I'm trying to remember whether it's a jackdaw or a magpie, or whether it's a magpie. Anyway, he's responsible for a little bird, and he's also becoming a father. And his own relationship with his father, Heathcote Williams, is part of the story. So but there are so many. Kafka's letter to his father, Jonathan Rayburn, the late Jonathan Rayburn, because he only died fairly recently, but his memoir of his father came out this year. John Burnside. There are so many, really.
One transition that you describe very eloquently in the book is in alternating chapters. It is your father moving from being a sort of larger-than-life, in control, active patriarch to being diminished, dependent, passive, an older man, really. I mean, it feels like you spent quite a bit of your life trying to escape his influence, but at the same time, at the end, you come to terms with his imperfections, and you embrace who he was. Is that a fair summary of how you see the development of your relationship with him? I mean,
I think it is
being simplistic, but
no, I think it's fair. I mean, I was typical of my generation, perhaps most generations of younger men. You want to escape home, you want to escape your parents and their influence and example, and be something else, be something different. And because my dad would have loved nothing more than for me to join the family practice, be a doctor. And I'd gone off and become a poet and done an English degree and PhD. I'd rebelled against what he wanted, and I thought I'd moved a long way away from his life and the kind of person he was. And then suddenly, at 75, he's vulnerable, he's ill, he's the thing that I never expected to happen, that he might die one day because he'd seemed godlike and invulnerable, was happening. And I had to see him in a different light, as frail, and it was a terrible shock and a terrible thing to come to terms with. That I was so naive in my late 30s still to assume he'd be around for a lot longer, and then realising he wasn't going to be. So there was certainly that kind of development and transition in the book, and I think a lot of people would recognise that the impatience we have with our parents, and then when we become parents, it begins a process of being more understanding of them, and then when they die, something else happens there too.
And one thing that's so noticeable about your writing is the sort of sensitivity and force of your descriptions of feeling and of emotion. Of course, traditionally men have tended to downplay the personal, the emotional, in order to fit in with prescribed notions of masculinity and the stereotype of the inexpressive male and so on and so forth. That's still prominent in some ways. But your approach seems to stand in contrast to this, and you express and interrogate emotion with great honesty. Given your father was pretty guarded, I wonder where you think this capacity in you emerged from. I mean, was it your mother's influence, or was it just conscious revolt, as you maybe suggested, or moving away? Poetry and literature? What were the factors that influenced you in this direction?
Maybe a bit of all of them. In some ways, my mother was more guarded than my father. My father could be quite emotional, actually. I remember him more or less crying when I went off to university. And compared with most men of his era, I think he was quite emotional. So, in an odd way, he might have had that influence on me. I think certainly the poetry I read, if you like confessional poetry, the stuff associated with Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, John Berryman might have had an influence. Also, simply, frankly, it was the emotional state I was in the aftermath of my dad's death that I was unguarded. My normal censoring devices were gone. I mean, I'd been a poet. I'd published a book. The first book of poems was called Dark Glasses, and one of the reviewers said, you don't see the eyes and you don't see the heart. I was kind of restrained as a poet, and then found writing the book in almost blind in that year after my dad died. It was, it was inevitable part of grief and loss and trying to bring someone back to life, probably, that that I was going to say all over the place, but I was all out there in much more than I would normally be. I didn't. It all happened fast, and I didn't have time to think. Oh, I better cut that passage. Oh, I better leave that out. That's a bit too unguarded. I didn't have that.
No,
that wasn't going on.
Because in a way, all your books of memoir are actually, they're about your family, but they're also about you as well. And I think I read something you wrote somewhere where you said, well, Virginia Woolf said a successful memoir, has something about the person to whom things happened.
Yeah,
and if you leave that out, then there's no sort of thread to it. And so,
no, you're the narrator, and you had the relationship with these people. So I always thought the book about my dad was about my dad, one about my mum, about her, one about. But actually, my relationship with them is an inevitable part of that. You do write about yourself, and there's also something else that goes on with me, which is I think I'm exposing them in some way, in a way that some people find uncomfortable, I suppose. But I think I'm embarrassing myself too. I'm showing, I'm exposing myself, and that's, that's fair's fair. You're playing fair.
Yeah.
You can't, and also, frankly, if a narrator, if a narrator is a goody-goody and everybody else is sort of flawed or wicked, or they're a blank sheet, you don't get to know them, then you're not going to enjoy the book or like the book. So, you have to be that kind of flawed narrator, I think.
Well, I was just thinking that, through the 3 books, you're kind of tracing your own journey as well, in a sense.
I suppose that's true. I kind of thought my rule was I'm not going to come into this except in relation to the scenes I'm describing, relating to these 3 other people. But I'm probably kidding myself and revealing more of myself than I realise. I mean, there's a bit of me feels, what the hell? You only have the one life. Why? Why do I have to be guarded? What's gained by it? Also, of course, you do keep things back. You're not on a live show. You have, you can control it. You control exactly what it is you let slip, or you're not letting it slip, are you? You're actually choosing to reveal this rather than being harassed into telling stuff that you don't want to really tell.
Yeah, it felt to me like maybe across the 3 memoirs, maybe that one of the reasons driving you to write them might have also been about trying to process and deal with the grief of your family members dying, and and I wondered, given the focus of our podcast, do you think that men and women grieve in different ways in your experience?
Yes, I do, and I hate it if it sounds stereotypical, but yeah, I think they do. I mean, I think from what I've seen of men and women grieving, women are more open about it. They don't feel they have to that it's something that's forbidden or awkward to declare emotion, whereas men, the ones I know anyway, put it that way, don't tend to talk about the emotional impact of a death or of loss, and that there's still that difference about women being more open emotionally. I mean, huge generalization, and it doesn't apply to all women, and some men are vulnerable and confessional, but in general I'd say there is still that difference. And I think a lot of work has been done to try and encourage men to feel they can, that it's not some betrayal of masculinity to talk about your feelings, but there's still there that kind of fear or inhibition. Let's talk about the sport. Let's talk about other stuff, not this.
I think one revealing little anecdote in your and when did you last see your father book was about you keeping your father's pacemaker after his death, which some might think, oh, why would you do that? But in another way, you've kept the medical part of him. Of course, as you've said, he was a GP, and in another, you could say, well, he kept what made him tick. If I can put it that way. So how would you explain your desire to keep this particular piece of him?
Well, I suppose it was inside him. That's one thing. It's, you can't get much more intimate and personal than a thing that has been in the body of another person. In truth, I kept a lot of his stuff. I went on wearing his clothes for quite a time. I still have some of his clothes. I keep the pacemakers in this room on the shelf as I speak. And I've only slowly let myself give away, his doctor's bag and various, an RAF coat and things that, I treasured as a way of trying to keep him for years and years after his death. But, it has been over 30 years now, and I've begun to let go a bit. Because I've got to let go of my own stuff too.
Yeah, well, there's that too.
Time to declutter a bit.
Your house gets a bit crowded otherwise, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'm certainly finding that.
Yeah. And I'm certainly, given that I'm moving to Australia soon, I'm finding this as well. I'm having to relinquish so much stuff, which is actually very painful, isn't it, to let go of these things?
It is, and my dad was a hoarder. I mean, he in a way, I'm hugely in his debt that he was, because one of the things he hoarded was the great box of letters that he and my mum exchanged during the Second World War when they'd first met, and they were long before children came along. And they were amazing to read after my mum died, because there was detail about days they'd spent together, or their thoughts, their feelings, everything was all there on paper in a way extraordinary from 1940s, whereas something I'd done last week I'd completely forgotten about. There was this record day by day. So, and that was him hoarding, and it I don't have the hoarding instinct as much, but it is hard to let go of stuff.
And those letters formed the basis of your second memoir, didn't they? Things my mother never told me.
Exactly. There were so for instance, when I wrote the book about my dad, I was worried what my mum would think and I vowed that if she hated it, I'd put it away. And I was worried about the revelation of the affair, even though I'd changed names. And she said, oh, well, I'm really sorry you have to put this in the book, but what the hell, I'll just tell people you were sexing the book up with all this stuff. And then she said, and I was worried about the details of my dad's cancer and so on, but she was a doctor, so she didn't bother with that. But one of the odd things she said could I change or cut was a passing mention of her being a Catholic. She said, oh, not many people know that. And I thought, well, okay, fine, I'll take that out. But when I read through the letters that my parents had exchanged, I realised what a big deal it was that one of my father's classic English middle-class, Middle England prejudices and his family's was against Catholics. And my father had to hide from his father for a very long time that this Irish woman he was courting was a Catholic. And it was extraordinary that that this was such a big deal in the middle of the 20th century. But many people have told me similar stories, having read the book, in their families that about the ferocity of anti-Catholic feeling. And again, it was only thanks to my dad's hoarding that I was able to read those letters and see what a big deal it was.
And is it right that you didn't know that she had 19 siblings until
No, I didn't.
later
No,
on? I mean, that's rather extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it was extraordinary. And again, if we think about the 50s and when they're nostalgic for the 50s, that was another secret. She did not want people to know what a huge family she came from, because that meant Catholic. And it was only when I went over to Ireland after a death and met one of the relations who showed me brought the list out of the 20 children.
Amazing.
So again, there we were, the classic English family with the two children and dogs and so on. But my mum had been in this extraordinary setting. I should say that some of them died, and she was, another way of putting it, she was the 12th of 13 because 7 of them died in childbirth or soon after. But still.
One thing we wanted to ask about as well was, to what extent do you think feminism has shaped your kind of personal development and your writing? Because you say, almost as an aside in Two Sisters, that the authors you discovered at university, like Germaine Greer, Kate Millett, Andrea Dworkin, kind of changed your ideas in a way which I think is kind of, is clear in your writing, right? But perhaps until that point, perhaps you'd taken male dominance for granted. So yeah, could you say a little bit about how that change took place for you?
Yes, I think I did, and I think the whole culture that I was growing up in, everything from nursery rhymes through to films, was affirming and perpetuating male dominance, and to some extent male violence. I mean, I remember there must be quite a number of 50s and 60s films where you see a man hit a woman, which you would never see on a film today, but then it was far more prevalent in the culture too. And I think, when I think back to girlfriends and adolescence, I'm afraid the kind of the chief belief really amongst my male at this male grammar school I was at was, the girl you try and get off with her, and you try and have sex with her, and she will not want to have sex because she's a girl, but also for fear of pregnancy and so on. And so, you try and get around her, you try and cajole her into a sexual relationship, after which, once she's had sex with you, you dump her. That seemed to be the culture then, and there were all sorts of very dodgy ideas involved in all that, about female sexuality, about men and the power of men, and I was growing up with that, and I may have instinctively taken against it, but I think it did take reading feminist texts and the female unit. I remember that coming out. I remember because I was at Nottingham University and I was studying D.H. Lawrence, and then I read the Kate Millett book, Was It About Lawrence, and so on. That all that was changing my ideas, and I think a lot of men at the same time as me, through the cultural change, also through the women who were with, who were rejecting that kind of setup. They were young, they were opinionated, and they weren't going to take the shit that their mothers had taken. So all that combined to have an influence, I think, and it was generally a feminist kind of influence. at the same time, I don't want to make myself sound like some saintly person, because I think my setup in the marriage was that my wife had a much bigger role domestically and in childcare. I'd say I did a lot more than most of the men I knew of my age around home, but I was still doing less. Whereas I think my daughter now with her partner, it's a pretty equal sharing of burdens and responsibility. Like they each have a day off a week to look after their small child, and they each have 4 working days and 1 day where they're looking after, and then the weekend together and so on. So they've tried to do it on a 50-50 basis.
And obviously, poetry, literature has played a really important part in your life. I mean, do you think that these things can or do play an important role potentially in shifting a young man's ideas about things like masculinity, gender relations, being a man? And if so, do you have any particular books you would recommend for young men out there, perhaps looking for a Christmas gift or similar?
Oh, God. No, well, I'm going to turn to you and suggest that you suggest some books for young men. I mean, I think of my youngest son. I don't think he'd need such books now. I mean, he's thoroughly sort of feminized in his ideas. You know, his parents are the backward ones now on lots of social issues. I do think, to go back to your question, I do think that poetry, literature, the stuff I was reading had a big impact. Coming to terms with D.H. Lawrence, and who went through this very patriarchal period of wanting male supremacy, partly when he was in Australia, that contributed to it, but in Mexico as well, and so on. It was just a period he was going through. I thought that was really interesting to come to terms with that, because the young Lawrence and the Paul Morrell in Sons and Lovers seems, not a feminized young man, but definitely in touch with feelings, and not a traditional masculine construct. And yet then Lawrence went into this big thing, pro-masculinity. So that I did a thesis on Lawrence, and I think that that also had an impact. And I think probably also studying literature at university, there were some guys doing an English degree at Nottingham. One of them climbed Everest later. One of them died climbing, but mostly were women. And now, if I went to a publisher's party the other day, and there were about, I don't know, half a dozen guys and 100 women. And it's sometimes you think literature is the female form. I mean, that the people publishing it, people writing it, all the people I'm involved with really in writing are women, and that's been the case for quite a while. Female agent was first female publisher from the beginning, and so on. So I think all that has an effect for sure, even if we're still, undeniably male.
Oh, well, I'm sure we're very, very glad that you've been flying the flag for men writing about these more personal, emotional issues for many years. I mean, I certainly know. I first read When Did You Last See Your Father? When it came out, but I read it again in preparation for this, and actually I saw quite a lot of different things in it this time. And of course, in the interim, my parents have both died, and so some of the things that you talk about that, the transition to older man status, and being in hospital and all that. Well, I've now seen that, I've experienced that, and so I have different points of connection. So if I was going to make a recommendation, I'd say to people of my age, actually middle-aged men, you should be reading this as well. It's not just an issue for young men. Middle-aged men, older men can also get quite a lot from literature and from some of the exploration that you've done. So thank you so much for that.
No, thank you for the recommendation. Yeah, out there into the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to read all of your memoirs, because I also think it's so important, and I think it's so great that you do reflect on your relationships with women and the significance of those, because we just don't see men talking very much about that, I don't think, do we, as you've highlighted. So
no, I suppose 2 of the 3 books are about women, aren't they?
Yeah.
The 3 memoirs are about
Absolutely.
women, even though my father remains, the large figure in many ways through all three of them. But they are predominantly,
Yeah.
weighted towards women.
Oh, well, thank you so much for spending some time with us. It was great to hear your readings and to talk to you and to explore some of the issues that you've been thinking about working on for so long. So thank you very, very much. It's great. Well, Stephen, I feel as if I need a bit of time to sort of process the whole range of issues that Blake brought up with us. There's so much depth to that conversation, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, no, I mean, it's a bit like his books, really, isn't it? You kind of go through a whole roller coaster of experiences and emotions, and it's very hard not to think about the connections to your own life. But no, I think it was, I'm really grateful to him for sharing everything he did with us, and I do think it's very interesting that he's written a book about his two sisters, because I think, first of all, I suppose, sibling relationships, maybe we don't actually talk or think that much about them and the influence they have on us and the influence they have on men's lives and on masculinity and how that's constructed. If I think about my own life, I have one older brother and he's had a humongous influence on me in my life, and I'm sure he will continue to do so for the rest of my life. And obviously that is such a formative relationship, isn't it, in terms of masculinity? And then I imagine the dynamic must be very different if it's a brother and a sister. And perhaps, for example, that could give some men more of an insight into women's everyday lives and experiences and some empathy there, although Blake in his book does provide examples as well of some quite toxic relationships there as well. But fundamentally, as he points out, this is potentially the person, if you do have a sibling, who knows you, who you know for the longest. So it's a hugely important, pivotal relationship, isn't it? And you have some siblings, I think, don't you, as well?
It's true. I mean, I've got two brothers and a sister, so I could certainly connect with some of the issues he was raising there. And it also made me think about that book that we wrote with Nicole and various others, about how men came to take action against violence against women. And one of the key points in there was about relationships with siblings or with women, shall we say. So mothers, sisters, girlfriends, and the impact they had on young men's perceptions and upbringing. So, it does connect with the sort of the sociological literature as well in that sense. But
yes, and I can't help but think that the close relationships with women that Blake clearly had is one of the reasons why he is so perceptive and skillful and sensitive about emotion and his ability to
I mean, that's well possible. I think he did say that, but at the same time, he also said that his mother was perhaps more guarded than his father. So, we're not just sort of ciphers for this stuff. We are real people as well. But I was struck too by the incredible sort of process of unearthing and trying to make sense of family relationships that he's gone through over this extended period, and as you said, I find points of connection with that too, and as I said in the interview that when I first read and When Did You Last See Your Father, my parents were both alive, but actually I read it recently for this interview, and they died in between, and so I connected in a different way, and felt myself being part of that sort of transitional process which he went through. And I also thought it was interesting that he in the end he says, this is not a process with an end. So I picked up there was a little passage which I thought I'd read from Two Sisters where he effectively says that, towards the end he says, the point about revisiting the past is that you find new things each time you go there, things you missed or didn't understand or failed to see the significance of, which as you get older you begin to grasp. If I'm addicted to the past, I tell her, and he means his wife there, it's because it hasn't passed. I'm still there, still working things out. And in a way, we're all doing that, and maybe particularly so towards the ends of our lives, really. We're trying to make a sense of who our parents were and who we are in relation to them. And I'm sitting here, I've got trunks of stuff sitting behind me, and old photographs and whatever, and there's part of me thinks, well, that's a whole load of lumber. You've got to move on. But actually, talking to Blake, you think, there's so much history, so much material there that you just can't be rid of that too easily, and in a way we all need to process that too. So it's powerful stuff.
It is, and I think his books actually are a really great way of helping us to reflect on our own histories and lives and childhoods and families, isn't it? So I would heartily recommend everybody to read them, and also check out the film of And When Did You Last See Your Father with Colin Firth and other great actors as well. That's really good. But that's probably enough for today.
Yeah, I think so.
So as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we will take a little break now, but we'll aim to be back with our next episode in February. And in the meantime, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. As always, do check out our previous episodes if you haven't yet done so, and share them with your friends and family and colleagues. And have a lovely festive period.
Yeah, happy Christmas to all our listeners.
Yeah, happy Christmas. And do contact us, as always, at nowandmen@gmail.com if you have any feedback, especially positive feedback, but any feedback's welcome. And thank you so much for listening.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.